So it used to be that it was enough for U.S. companies to bring their expertise and best practices over from the U.S. and just transplant the way they operated to the Chinese business environment, and that's increasingly not the case.
In recent years, we've seen China sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement. We've also seen China pass an environmental protection law. What are some of the other emerging trends that you're seeing?
Well, I think overall China is getting serious about environmental protection, which is a positive thing. You've seen these centrally led enforcement campaigns, and these have had some unintended consequences, such as increasing uncertainty in the business environment and disrupting supply chains. But actually, for multinationals, there's been a silver lining. Multinationals often have high standards. They bring their best practices and expertise from their operations around the globe to China, whereas historically, sometimes regulators in China have turned a blind eye to violations by domestic polluters, which in effect acts as a subsidy for their production. And by raising the standards of enforcement for everyone, this has, at least in the environmental sphere, leveled the playing field.
What are some of the top compliance challenges that companies are facing? I know our focus is foreign, but I understand that domestic companies are also being affected.
Yeah, I think one big challenge is one-size-fits-all enforcement. For example, in an industrial park, if there's one, egregious polluter, sometimes the authorities will shut down the entire park, instead, compliant companies and all. Or, for example, on a day with particularly bad air pollution, they'll order capacity cuts across the board instead of, adjusting it based on different companies' baseline emissions, which essentially punishes companies that employ environmentally efficient technologies. Another challenge would be sometimes that environmental standards aren't necessarily based in science or don't take a risk-based approach. One example we heard of was, a standard required a company to use a certain type of technology to burn off emissions that actually had a larger carbon footprint, because of the energy required to burn off the emissions than the emissions themselves had. So, sometimes if the standards aren't developed in a nuanced way, they'll work at cross purposes with their actual goal. A third challenge, I think, would be transparency, and this is something we see across a lot of areas in China's business environment, but in the environmental area in specific, we've heard companies complain that sometimes local environmental standards aren't published online, or sometimes they can't get a hold of them at all, and how do you comply with a rule that you can't see? And also, policy implementation timelines can sometimes be very short. We saw this with China's ban on scrap imports, which caused havoc across global supply chains. And then a fourth challenge would be hazardous waste disposal. So in our recent environmental report, we interviewed around 30 companies, and almost all of them mentioned this as a challenge, and the main reason is that hazardous waste disposal vendors are in short supply.
With stricter policies and heightened enforcement, how do companies have to change their environmental compliance practices, and how would it differ from in the United States?
So it used to be that it was enough for U.S. companies to bring their expertise and best practices over from the U.S. and just transplant the way they operated to the Chinese business environment, and that's increasingly not the case. We're increasingly seeing that Chinese environmental standards are, in some cases, higher than most international standards. So it's more and more important for companies to pay attention to new regulations. Another change is that with the increased volume of inspections, companies need to dedicate more resources to compliance. You could see this in more manpower required to shadow inspectors, train employees on how to deal with inspectors, also following up with local regulators after inspections. This all just requires more resources. A third element would be it's always been important for companies to conduct due diligence, but this is ever increasingly important, not only on their suppliers to make sure that they are compliant, but also if a company is starting a new investment or relocating operations, making sure that they aren't located next to a heavy polluter, which could increase their risk for shutdown, or making sure there aren't legacy environmental issues where they could be saddled with liability from a plot of land's previous occupant, for example, with soil pollution. So this is another place that's increasingly important to pay attention to. And then I guess finally a best practice that is important in a lot of areas is just to make sure you have a strong relationship with your regulator, both at the industrial park level and at every level up the chain, all the way to the central level, and to deal with transparency challenges. They can be an additional channel for information, and also if you run into enforcement or issues or have issues with a specific policy, if you have a good relationship with the regulator, they're often very receptive to industry input, anything to help them make environmental standards more nuanced and help them achieve their goals of strong environmental protection while maintaining healthy economic growth. I doubt you would disagree. Is that bad for me to readjust like that?
No, but it's bad to look over here and say that.
We'll start over. So stricter enforcement campaigns and more enforcement campaigns. Sorry, I forgot the question.